Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community was published in 1967, 2 years after the Voting Rights Act, and it is the least discussed of King's major works. That gap is not accidental. The book contains King's most direct assessment of what the movement had actually achieved, and his answer was specific and uncomfortable. The legal victories were real. The structural conditions that racial inequality depended on had not changed. King named why. The argument he made pointed at the economic system itself, and at the political pattern that had learned to grant enough surface change to absorb the pressure for anything deeper. That argument did not get preserved in the version of King most people inherited. This video is about what it said. The Civil Rights Act passed in 1964. The Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. By any measure of legislative progress, these were genuine victories, the result of years of sustained, organized pressure applied at enormous personal cost to the people who built and maintained the movement. King knew this. He also knew that the conditions those laws were meant to address had not resolved. Black poverty rates remained disproportionately high. The wealth gap had not closed. The economic infrastructure of segregation, discriminatory lending, exclusion from labor markets, concentrated poverty in urban communities systematically starved of public investment, had not been dismantled by legislation that addressed its legal expression. Where Do We Go From Here was King's attempt to account for that gap. Written in 1967, with Johnson's War on Poverty already being defunded to pay for Vietnam, it was an assessment of what had been won and what the movement would have to do next if it was serious about the conditions it had been fighting for. The book's title named the choice King believed the country was facing. His answer was that without structural change, not legal adjustment, not symbolic recognition, but a fundamental reordering of how resources were distributed, the instability the movement had surfaced would not resolve. It would accumulate. King's central argument in the book is precise. The legislative gains of the mid-60s were necessary. They were also, in his framing, surface changes, alterations to the legal expression of a system whose underlying economic logic remained intact. Ending legal segregation did not alter the conditions that made segregation economically useful to the people who had built it. Granting voting rights did not redistribute the wealth that determined whose interests the political system was organized around. The mechanism he identified was specific. Granting surface change was politically easier than granting structural change, and it was effective at absorbing the pressure that structural change required. A movement that won a legal victory had won something real. It had also, in the same moment, lost some of the pressure that had produced the victory. The people who preferred the existing economic structure had learned that conceding on legal terrain was cheaper than conceding on economic terrain. Surface change was the price they were willing to pay to protect what actually mattered to them. This is the argument that explains why this book specifically does not get discussed alongside King's other major works. The version of King that gets preserved, the dreamer, the unifier, the figure who wanted legal equality, is compatible with the surface change the system was willing to grant. The King in this book was describing why that version of him was insufficient, and what the people managing his legacy had an interest in not amplifying. That is not a conspiracy. It is the same mechanism he was describing applied to his own memory. King was explicit in Where Do We Go From Here in a way he had not been in earlier work. Capitalism as a system, he argued, was structurally incapable of distributing resources justly, not because of the failures of individual actors within it, but because of the logic that organized it. A system built around the accumulation of private wealth would distribute resources according to the requirements of that accumulation, not according to human need. Adjusting the system's outputs without altering that logic produced surface change. The logic remained. His specific proposal was a guaranteed annual income, a federal floor beneath which no American's income would fall, regardless of employment status. The argument was structural. Poverty was not primarily the result of individual failure, and it would not be resolved by programs targeted at individual behavior. It required a direct intervention in the distribution of resources at the level of the system itself. That proposal did not gain traction in 1967. The conversation it belongs to has not gone away. A growing share of the population has arrived at a version of King's conclusion that capitalism in its current form is not producing acceptable outcomes for most people, through their own experience of those outcomes. The Democratic Socialist candidates winning elections in 2025 and 2026 are, in part, the political expression of that conclusion. Zoran Mamdani winning the New York City mayoral Democratic primary against Andrew Cuomo. Melat Quiroz in Colorado defeating a candidate who had held the seat for roughly 30 years. These are not isolated upsets. They are voters deciding that the candidates who had been delivering surface change for decades were no longer sufficient, and choosing candidates running explicitly on structural alternatives. King described the conditions that produced that kind of political shift in 1967. The shift is happening now. The title of the book names a choice, not a prediction. King was not forecasting chaos as an inevitable outcome. He was describing what the consistent deferral of structural change produced over time, and arguing that the people who preferred surface change were not avoiding instability, they were accumulating it. The pattern across the decades since is observable. Each political cycle produces candidates who campaign on genuine change. The change that gets delivered is adjustment at the edges, programs that address symptoms, reforms that modify the most visible features of a problem without touching its economic foundation, victories that can be pointed to while the underlying conditions persist. The frustration this produces is not irrational. It is the accurate perception that the problem has not been resolved, compounded across election after election in which the same promise was made and the same surface adjustment was delivered. The electoral results of recent cycles are one measure of where that accumulation has reached. Decade-long incumbents losing to candidates with no political background but a specific argument about structural change is not a random event. It is the political expression of a population that has watched surface change fail to resolve the conditions it was supposed to address, and concluded that the people delivering it are not going to deliver anything else. King named that dynamic 60 years ago. He called it the choice between chaos and community. The choice has not been made yet. The accumulation continues. King's diagnosis and where do we go from here was the most comprehensive argument he ever made about the economic structure of the country. But the year he wrote it, 1967, was also the year he was watching the country face a wider crisis, the aftermath of urban uprisings, the fracturing of the coalition that had produced the legislative victories of the mid-60s, and a national mood that had shifted sharply from the optimism of 1963. His response to that moment is what the next video covers. The Trumpet of Conscience was King's assessment of where the country stood and what he believed was still possible, written in the final year of his life, with full knowledge of what the previous decade had cost.